Well, good morning. And on behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, let me welcome you to this conversation today on a very important topic and on a very interesting book that helps us game out a scenario in the relatively near future of a great powers competition, and in fact, a war between the US, China, and others. That will help us think about what we ought to be doing, planning, thinking about today, in addition to just being an interesting read. We are very pleased to have our very own Mike Rogers, former Intelligence Committee Chairman, to help engage on this conversation. Very pleased to have the authors of the book, Elliot Ackerman and Admiral James Stavridis, joining us this morning. I do want to give a quick shout out to our Joshua Huminski, who has written, I think, quite an interesting review of the book. And I'm going to drop that in the chat box for your use. We will have Q&A for the audience, so whenever you feel moved, we'll go generally first come, first serve. Please go ahead and use the Q&A function to submit questions. The book is 2034, A Novel of the Next World War. And we're pleased to have both Elliot Ackerman, who has a distinguished career in the U.S. Marines. And also, I wanted to mention, interestingly, was a principal with Americans Elect, an organization that was organized to try to help fashion a more bipartisan approach to leadership in the United States. That is very much a philosophy which matches that of the way CSPC functions. You'll note that our senior leadership is a bipartisan team here. So we appreciate your efforts on that, Elliot. And Admiral Stavridis, very pleased to have you as well. Admiral Stavridis had a very distinguished career in the U.S. Navy. Was also the dean of the Fletcher School. And I won't read his entire bio, but very notably was NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and knows a thing or two about United States defense and national security. So great background on the authors. I don't want to take any more time on the intro. Let me throw it over to them to talk a little bit about, introduce the book to us, and then Mike will pick up and start a conversation with them. Admiral, do you want to go ahead and start?
I do. Thank you for having us, and always a pleasure to be with good friend and colleague, Chairman Rogers. Let me start with how we got here. And we began to write a book about the future by looking to the past. And what I mean by that is we looked at the Cold War and wondered what allowed the United States and the Soviet Union to avoid going to the big dance, to avoid a nuclear conflagration that would have ended the world. I would believe that part of the answer to that question, how did we avoid it, is because the Cold War had a rich body of literature, both book and film, things like Dr. Strangelove, Red Storm Rising, The Third World War by Sir John Hackett, Bedford Incident, Failsafe, On the Beach, a very rich literature of, frankly, how terrible it would have been if the US and the Soviet Union ended up in a hot war. So then we kind of looked, okay, what's developing right now? And you can argue whether we're already in a Cold War with China or we're in the foothills of a Cold War, as Henry Kissinger says, or no, we're too intertwined, all that's hype. I tend to agree with Dr. Kissinger on most things, as any smart person would. I think we're at least in the foothills of a Cold War with China, and we're ascending the mountain, not going down. So our thought was, let's write a cautionary tale. Not a predictive story, but a cautionary tale. Something that says, this is how it could happen. This is why the ladder of escalation would be deeply difficult to control. This is what it would look like in terms of human cost. And that's kind of the point of the book. So we looked at US and China. But to do that coherently 10 to 15 years from now, you also have to look at cyber, at space, at the actions of other nations. So you see Iran, you see Russia involved, you see India involved very deeply in ways that may surprise you. So we decided to kind of get out of at least I did. This is Elliot's 5th novel. This is my first after 9 works of nonfiction. I kind of decided to take off the straitjacket of nonfiction and try and splash a little paint around the canvas. And that's what fiction allows you to do, to paint a picture. In this case, I hope a chilling picture that can become voyage. My shipmate was Elliot Ackerman, not only a combat Marine, a Marine Raider, White House Fellow, but as I said, a very accomplished novelist. Working with him, watching the craft of his ability to put a novel together and to employ characters and bring them to life was a marvelous experience for me. So that's a quick sketch of the book. And if I could, I'll throw it over to my co-author, Elliot, to maybe talk a little about some of the characters. Elliot?
Hey, thanks so much, Jim. So when this book opened, it starts with a precipitating incident, and that incident occurs in the South China Sea, a body of water I'm sure many of you are very, very familiar with, and on a freedom of navigation patrol, a type of operation that U.S. forces and our allies conduct today. And so we meet one of the first principal characters, Sarah Hunt, and she is a commodore of a 3-ship flotilla that is navigating those waters. She is the she is the daughter of a career Navy officer who served in naval special warfare, and she herself in the year 2034 is a veteran of naval special warfare, but is finishing her career in the surface Navy. When we meet her flotilla has spied what appears to be a Chinese fishing trawler in distress, and under current obligations, she goes to investigate exactly what is going on with this ship. So cut to the Strait of Hormuz near Iranian airspace, where our second principal character, Major Chris Wedge Mitchell, a 4th generation Marine fighter pilot, is flying a state-of-the-art F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, flirting right up against Iranian airspace and sitting in the cockpit lamenting the fact that unlike his great-grandfather, grandfather, and father before him, he no longer feels like much of a pilot because the technology underneath him has gotten too advanced. The planes just seem to fly themselves. And as he's thinking this, his plane literally does begin to fly itself. It flies itself directly into Iranian airspace, and he is unable to control it. So now cut to the Situation Room in the White House, where we meet our third principal character, Dr. Sandeep Sandy Chowdhury, who is a 1st-generation American. His family immigrated to this country from India. He is also, of course, a graduate of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And he is watching both of these crises develop, or at least situations at this point, develop in real time. The fishing trawler in the South China Sea that is starting to seem to be anything but a fishing trawler, and the loss of control of one of our aircraft. As he's trying to figure out what's going on, the phone rings in the Situation Room. On the other line is our 4th principal character, Admiral Lin Bao, the military attaché for China to the United States. And Admiral Lin Bao has a message for Chowdhury. It's that these two events are in fact interrelated, and that the Chinese government is quickly losing patience with these freedom of navigation patrols. As this back and forth occurs between Lin Bao and Chowdhury, there is a cyber attack, which is basically the equivalent of the entire U.S. Eastern Seaboard being blinked. The power goes off, the power goes back on. And I would just mention that incident happens right at the end of the very first chapter, so no spoilers here. And I would just add that there is one fifth character who is a principal character, and that is Brigadier Qasim Farshad of the Iranian Quds Force. And when Wedge, the Marine pilot, lands in Iran, standing on the tarmac to meet him is Farshad. And Farshad is a veteran of the Forever Wars, although obviously he fought on the opposite side. And he is the namesake, Qasim Farshad, of General Qasem Soleimani, who was his godfather, and who Farshad's father died protecting and subverting an assassination attempt when Qasim Farshad was very young. So with those 5 characters, the table is set and you enter the world of 2034. A conflict that quickly spans the entire globe. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Well, first of all, thank you both. And Elliot, first, thanks for your, I think you served 5 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, Bronze Star, Silver Star, Purple Heart. So you come at this with certainly a unique perspective, and thanks for that. And certainly Admiral Stavridis, who is just renowned in national security spaces for his work, not only as commanding battle groups, but his work subsequent to that. The 2 things I'm just really horribly disappointed in this book is there was no real Army star character, number 1, and no FBI guy. I was like, what the heck? I read the whole thing. I kept waiting, page after page, waiting to get there. Nothing.
I'm going to reveal something to you. We are in the process of concluding an agreement for a sequel, and I promise there will be an FBI character. Publicly, I make that promise, Chairman.
But I'm tearing up right now thinking about that. Thank you. Thanks for doing that. Well, first of all, to the audience, it's a great book. It's not a hard read. It's a kind of a fun read. Even though it's a serious topic, it has serious consequences. I really enjoyed getting after it, and it's a good long weekend kind of read for me, and I enjoyed that. So thank you for that. Tell me, Admiral, how did you go from the serious national security guy who writes nonfiction to this? I mean, tell me about that transition. You mentioned it a little bit. Elliot certainly had the knack already. He's got several. And by the way, I just didn't. This just came out on the bestseller list, didn't it? New York Times.
It is. Just hit number 6. Thank you. Number 6 on New York Times, and number 7 on Amazon, combined fiction and nonfiction. So yeah, it's a lot of people are picking it up and reading it. And that's kind of the first answer to the question, Chairman, is simply that I could reach a broader, different audience than if I wrote another book about the oceans of the world, or a book about China in a very serious policy-oriented way. I could have written that book. I could have hit the usual suspects in that audience, that circuit that you and I know so well. But I really felt this is the looming tower of our times. This potentially could happen with devastating effect, orders of magnitude effect, more than Pearl Harbor, 9/11, 20-year war in Afghanistan, pandemic, all the other things that have shocked us in recent times. This one could be, apocalyptic. The book is not, by the way. The book does not have a happy ending, but it is not the end of the world. I will allow that. So point 1 is reach a broader audience. Point 2, as I hope you picked up, as we heard from Elliot, it's this ability to allow these characters to carry the story. And I feel as though the book does a very fair job of allowing the Chinese character, Lin Bao, to tell that side of the story. I think it does a very good job on Brigadier General Farshad. And there are always stories, and you know this better than anyone from your life in intelligence, that the person on the other side of the table, more often than not, is not inherently, deeply, Machiavellianly evil. The person over there has some profound beliefs about their society, their position, and you've got to understand those if you're going to sit and negotiate and avoid a war. So I think those are the 2 reasons fiction made a lot of sense to me, was the characters and hitting a broader audience.
Yeah, thank you for that. As my dad was a tech sergeant in the Air Force, so this question's coming to you, Elliot, and his son became a flag officer, a general officer in the Army. And he always used to say, and I'm going to substitute Admiral for General here. He always used to say, you know, you can always tell an Admiral, you just can't tell him much. I'm curious. Remember, this is a tech sergeant in the Air Force. How did you sit down and have this conversation with the Admiral on this book? I mean, how did you get there and talk about these characters? I mean, that's a switch, it's a change. And I'm just curious how that process went.
Oh, well, you know, and again, thanks so much for having me. It's great to see you, Chairman. You know, we've known one another for the better part of a decade. So, we have a relationship that predates this book. As I alluded to, we're both graduates of the Fletcher School. And when the Admiral was dean, he very kindly invited me to serve as the writer in residence for a semester. And when he sent me via email a list of my responsibilities in that kind of bullet pointed list, one of the bullet points was talk with the Admiral about books when he feels like it. So we'd spent a lot of time talking about books. I knew his sensibility. You know, we also share an editor at Penguin Press, Scott Moyers. So knew each other as well through our shared editor. And so when this project came up, you know, I just immediately had a sense that this would be, you know, a great experience for me, a lot of fun to do. You know, it's always a pleasure when you have opportunities to deepen a friendship. And so we sat down and kind of talked about what we thought the book could be. Our visions were immediately aligned. We wanted to have a book that was, you know, that was character driven, that got at all of these issues. We talked about what the first chapter would be, you know, and then we went and we said, let's see if we can write it together. And we did, and it was a lot of fun. And then, you know, that's just how we did it. Chapter by chapter, wrote the book.
How long did it take you?
Help people, you know, for a grim subject, we had a lot of fun writing.
Yeah. Well, it's a cautionary tale, I think, which is really, really important. You know, what struck me, when you had, I think it was the Chinese lead in the book who was talking about teaching classics to Americans after all of this would be over. Yeah. And he talked about at the time about the dysfunction, the political dysfunction. So, I mean, it's really interesting. I love the way you all took all of the problems that many in national security circles talk about and weaved this into the story to where it had impact, both positive and negative, actually. And when he was talking about that piece in the chapter where he wanted to teach American students and how that they had maybe failed. I don't know. You remember where I'm talking about here? So can you talk about that a little bit? I mean, how did you draw on that piece? I mean, and one of the things, in national security circles that is the common theme today is, hey, we're a little bit broken here in the United States. We can't seem to have a conversation with people we disagree with without shouting. Yeah. And that's the theme I got out of that piece of it, is about, hey, listen, this doesn't always have to be this way in America. You don't always have to be the biggest kid on the block. That can change. And by the way, the first place that changes, if you look back through history, is political dysfunction, the rot within. And so I just wondered if you all could expound on that a little bit, because there was a lot of philosophy and I think truth in some of these sections when your main characters got off and started pondering their place in the world. Could you talk about that a little bit? Yeah,
maybe I could start, and then Elliot's written some absolutely brilliant nonfiction looking at this exact issue. In terms of Lin Bao, first of all, for me, he's the most compelling character in the book. He has an American mother and a Chinese father, yet he rises in ranks, always with a little tinge of suspicion following him, as you would expect, I suppose. But he's stuck in a desk job in Washington as the book opens, and all he wants is to get back to sea. And boy, have I been there. 6 tours in the Pentagon. And as a naval officer, you just want to be on the bridge of a ship again. And then Lin Bao knows, and thank you for such a close reading of the book, Chairman, he knows at the end of his military career, he wants to be involved in education. And of course, that's what I ended up doing on the advice, by the way, of a mutual friend of ours, Secretary of Defense Bob Gates.
Oh,
You know,
yeah.
we all know that Bob Gates famously ran the CIA and then was Secretary of Defense. What did he do in the middle? He spent 9 years in higher education as the dean of the Bush School and the president of Texas A&M. Best boss I ever had. He gave me that advice. Be an educator when you finish up. It's a great next chapter. So the point is, there's a lot to like about Lin Bao, and Lin Bao is a very close observer of the American political system. And another point there, by the way, is the Chinese tend to know a lot more about us than we do about them. They spend a lot of time thinking about America and our ideals and who we are and whether we are meeting them or they're breaking in front of us. So there's an awful lot of Lin Bao's observations, which I think are very correct. And before I toss the ball to Elliot, I'll just say, I think education is part of the way out of the thicket in which we have found ourselves. It is going to be hard. None of this is easy. We're not going to snap our fingers and suddenly convince everybody. But if we have better schools, if we have a curriculum that inculcates ideas of service and civics, if we consciously focus on education as part of the pathway out of our acrimony, I think we have a better chance of finding our way out of the maze that we have stumbled into here. Elliot?
Sure. You know, I would only add that sometimes, you know, people say to me, you know, isn't it funny after serving all these years in the Marines and in special operations, you became a novelist? First of all, the people who've known me the longest say, isn't it funny after you were such a kind of, you know, ragamuffin skateboarding kid that you became a Marine? That's a separate story. But actually, it's not that odd if you make this mental leap. You know, so much of my time in the Marine Corps was spent at the tactical level, sitting down with people in shuras or sitting in trucks on long patrols with the Afghans or Iraqis I advised, and just talking about the world, seeing and understanding deeply how they viewed our country, trying to kind of make the sales pitch for America, but also as you're making that sales pitch to a tribal leader, you know, knowing what the weaknesses are in that pitch and how they might view themselves compromised by it. So I think for any military person, so much of what you do, right, is you sit there and you deeply examine your adversary. You try to understand how they think because your job is to anticipate their actions. Well, as a novelist, so much of what you do is you try to get inside your character's head. And by definition, you're trying to anticipate and create what they're going to do in a world in a way that feels true to them. So, you know, in the sections of the book we wrote with Admiral Lin Bao or General Farshad, it's very much related to that act of active imagining and trying to occupy the thoughts of another person in order to anticipate them. So that's something I learned to do in the military, and it's something I continue to do and love to do, you know, in the books that I have the privilege of writing.
Yeah.
Can I just add a story, which is, you know, as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, of course, I commanded that mission for 4 years and was in and out of Afghanistan at least monthly for 2 or 3 days, went to every province in Afghanistan. And it took me a while to realize that you would pull up to these, you know, kind of muddy villages, and here would be an Afghan, and you'd get in a conversation with him, just as Elliot described. And when I started, I would say to them, well, in a great city far away, people are coming together to talk about the challenges going on here in Afghanistan. And at some point, some, you know, grizzled 75-year-old Afghan elder said to me through a translator, "Of course I know about that. That's the London Donor Conference that the United Nations is putting on, and NATO will be there." I mean, they get it. They know what's going on. And it's part of, as Elliot just said, you have to have the empathy for whomever you are speaking with if you're going to write truthfully about the world. I learned that in the course of my time in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I have some interesting stories on Afghanistan as well. I've spent a weekend at the hunting lodge up in the mountains along the the Fatah border with the former intelligence chief there, which was all about discussions about future. And it was amazing to me as well how tuned in they were to America and American problems, American successes, in a way I think most Americans would be shocked. I mean, when I say hunting lodge, there wasn't much lodge in the hunting lodge part of this trip for that weekend. So again, and Elliot, you have done some great writing on just about how you get people, get this thing unbroke, if you will. Can you talk a little bit about that nonfiction side, some of the work that you've been doing and the articles that you've been producing on this? I think it's really important.
Sure, thank you. Well, I think that, and this very much comes up in the book, that the United States can only respond strongly to an external threat if we have the ability, when needed, to unite at home. And I think, in recent memory, after September 11th, we saw that despite coming out of an extremely controversial election, being the 2000 election that was very divisive, we were able to quickly pivot, unite as a country, and respond. I mean, division obviously set in again, but I think this past year should be a wake-up call for us that when faced with a pandemic, we have not been able to. This has been an incredibly divisive year. That doesn't mean we can't turn things around, and I'm hopeful that we can, but I think it's important to be cognizant of the many failures that have occurred in America this year, as well as many accomplishments. I mean, we're rolling out a vaccine right now, but one of those failures has been a lack of unity in the face of a profound challenge. And I would only add something that I've written about a bit that is personal to me. I have concerns about the role of the U.S. military in society right now, concerns that as we have seen every single facet of our lives politicized. Every major institution now seems to have a political bent, whether it's moderate or very extreme. The military right now seems to be the one institution we can say does not have an overt political bias. But God help us if our politics creep into our military. And if we look back historically, the lifespan of republics that have extremely dysfunctional politics at home and extremely large and powerful standing militaries, it's not a strong track record. Let me put it that way historically. So I think we need to. That's something that we should all be thinking about, concerned about, and I worry that the civil-military divide that exists in this country right now keeps us from focusing on that distinct challenge. But that's extraneous to 2034. That's more into what I write about in my columns.
Well, that's what you're allowed to talk about. That this is the center of the study of the presidents. We talk about everything here, and it's all good. We'll get back to the book, but this is also really important.
Yeah.
I saw a percentage shift by just real quick, Admiral. I get your perspective on this as well. That it's for the first time, and I forget what the poll said. I want to say 20 some years, that the military's gone down a little bit with the American public, and I was a little bit taken back by that. And I'm curious for both of you why you think that's happening in the United States and what do we do to change it? Because I'm where Elliot is. That's the one institution. Well, I happen to think the FBI should have been the other one, but the one institution that we cannot lose faith and confidence in, because it allows all of us to have our political perspective, whatever it is on the spectrum.
I saw that same poll, and it does worry me. And I think there's a variety of reasons for it. Perhaps one is that there's less of a sense up close and personal about the sacrifice, because we're not seeing, fortunately, body bags coming home from Afghanistan, where we don't have 250,000 troops forward deployed, many of them killed in combat, tens of thousands of them with life-changing wounds. I think there's just a diminution in the sense on the part of the public of the level of sacrifice by the military. That's a prosaic thing. I think perhaps more importantly is Elliot's point that there is a sense, and I feel it, of creeping politicization within the military. And I see it on Facebook and Twitter with sergeants who were my security guards when I was Supreme Allied Commander in NATO. And I kind of have a pretty good sense of where they are politically, and they're pretty out there. Any number of people are. And I think in particular, a very tactical thing, but I think an important one, of the people who shamefully stormed the Capitol of the United States, 20% plus were veterans. And as you both know, in the veteran percentage in the country is somewhere around 7%. So almost 3 times the number were veterans. And the stories keep popping of the people, in many cases, that did the worst things were veterans. So that, I think, also contributed to that diminution. The real question is, what do we do about it? And here, I talked a moment ago about education. Here, I think a powerful thing we can and should be doing is broadening this idea of thank you for your service and celebrating it. And what I mean by that is people say to me all the time, and I appreciate it, you know, Admiral, thank you for your service. They mean thank you for your military service. Yet there are so many ways to serve this country. Police, firemen, diplomats, CIA officers, our frontline physicians and nurses in COVID, school teachers in Western Virginia teaching a packed classroom under COVID conditions for $37,000 a year. You think she's serving the country? Boy, I do. Peace Corps volunteers, Teach for America, Volunteer for America. You get the point. We need to broaden that idea. I would argue we need to incentivize it through tax breaks, through scholarships, a GI Bill for those who serve. We need to then talk about it. And I think by broadening that idea of service, which is both bipartisan and nonpartisan, I think that is another step to help get us out of this maze that we're in. So I'd add to the idea of education, this idea of celebrating service broadly. But yes, Chairman, I see those storm warnings about the military, and that is something we should all be worried about for the historical reasons Elliot mentions.
Yeah. Elliot, any thoughts on that?
You know, I would just add there are a number of behaviors I feel we have been engaging in as a society that are related to our military that I would characterize as late empire behaviors. I would argue that a 20-year war fought for increasingly obscure purposes where the mission has become very unclear is late empire behavior. I would argue that our relationship right now, where there's a significant civil military divide, is late empire behavior, particularly when combined with extremely dysfunctional politics at home. And one thing that concerns me is if you go back and look through history, I mean, from Athens to ancient Rome, you see this outsourcing of military service is late empire behavior. I mean, in Roman times, the way it was outsourced was the legions were no longer recruited from the Roman citizenry, right? They were recruited from the provinces, from the Gauls, from the Spaniards. And when that happened, there was this slow creep and kind of rotting of the republic from within. I would argue today what has occurred is we do a similar type of outsourcing, but instead of outsourcing our military service to another culture, as they did in Roman times, we've increasingly outsourced it to another subculture, which is our military subculture, in which you see military service becomes more hereditary. Its families have a tradition of service, and significant chunks of the United States of our population, they don't know anybody who serves. They have no idea, and that erodes this sense of citizenship, that we're all in it together. I mean, I'll relay an anecdote to you. I've written about this. When I came home from the wars, one or two times I was sort of taken aback when someone would ask me, did you kill anybody over there? And these were like well-meaning people, not trying to offend me, like actually trying to make this connection. And I never knew how to respond. And eventually I kind of took to the response of, well, if I did, you paid me to. And that sort of takes somebody back. But it's just this idea of, listen, like this, it's not like this war was only something that was an experience. This is all of us. We all went to war. And if we get into a society where our sense of wars is that it's something that a small subset is doing and it doesn't affect any of us, that is really deleterious to a healthy democracy And I think, to the spirit of this book as well, creates conditions where we can very easily sleepwalk into war if the body politic's conception of what war is, oh, well, we go to war. Well, when we go to war, that's what those people over there do. And our only real obligation to them is to, pay deference at sporting events or let them board the plane first and thank them. And we mean to, but let's face it, we have an all-volunteer military, so my child doesn't have to go unless they want to, and no one in my family does this. And there's no war tax because we just append our spending on these wars into our national deficit, which I think the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are something like 7 to 8 trillion of the national deficit. So it anesthetizes us to war. And a society anesthetized to war is a society that's more likely to enter wars. But newsflash, what happens when the next war is in Iraq and Afghanistan? What happens when it's a war with China, something that you cannot anesthetize yourself against?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I was in recently with some Army commanders who were talking about this next generation of leadership being talking about soldiers in combat, never have experiencing artillery fire. And when they're talking about this great power competition and how they shift resources, how do they retrain these soldiers to understand what this next battle would look like, which is nothing like the battle that they just fought. I mean, nothing like the battle they just fought. And they were very worried about how they get them acclimated to the kinds of decisions and leadership under even more stressful conditions in a big conflict. And it's really interesting watching them try to go through this process of making that turn. I think, to your point, Elliot, this next war is going to be very, very different. Yeah.
My generation of veterans, I've heard the joke made sort of many times in kind of gallows humor ways, we fear that we will be the equivalent of the veterans of the Boer War.
Yeah, it's so true. Well, it feels like it now, doesn't it? A little bit after writing your book and reading your book. It's very, very different.
Yeah, I just to pick up that point, and this, of course, is an area of deep expertise on your part, is cyber and cyber security and the potential for these weapons of cyber to begin to approach the level of damage that can be inflicted by a nuclear weapon. Yet we have very limited ways to precisely attribute where it comes from. If Kim Jong-un launches a ballistic missile, we know where it came from. Cyber, not so much. We're not terrible at that, but we're not perfect. More importantly, cyber is ubiquitous. It is part and parcel of everything we're doing. 40 billion devices connected to the internet, one for every 5 people on Earth. And it is a remarkable level of threat that is rising, and will certainly be part of the next military conflict, along with hypersonic cruise missiles, nanotechnology, the use of special forces, I think in very creative ways, perhaps with human performance enhancement attached to it. All of that knitted together from space. It's going to be a very different war. And we kind of sketched the outline of that in the book. But again, this is not Tom Clancy. We're not here to precisely footnote every one of these technologies. It kind of hovers over the human dimension in the book that we've talked about thus far.
Yeah, but you know what I liked in the book, that you talked about it in terms, you don't have to be a technologist. If you're a Tom Clancy fan, you love every detail, every nut and bolt. This, you don't have to be that you don't have to want to understand how the screws on the ship are turning at a certain point. You don't have to understand that part in order to enjoy this book and get that feeling about how technology is going to impact this next conflict in a very real and serious way. And I have been out there, as you know, Admiral, talking about the fact that we are just not prepared for this. And never have we been in a place where our national security is so dependent on the private sector.
Yeah.
You think about most of the networks, almost 90% of all the networks are private sector networks who the government is not, our best agency is not even allowed to be inside helping you protect it. Yeah. And so we're in this really strange place in our national security posture as we go forward. And the reason I love you talking about it is that's that way, and to Elliot's words, you can stumble in, you could sleepwalk into something and not realize it, because somebody makes a miscalculation on that cyber attack that ends up killing people in country, state A, because of the power's gone off for a month. mean, all of those things, this book, I think, makes you at least think about those things in a way that you just might not otherwise think about it. A lot of it, if you're a national security junkie like me, I think you look at this and go, wow, they touched on every bit of things that we know are problems and haven't figured them out yet. And if you're not, you're just going to go, I think you're going to read this book and go, wow, there's a lot of things we ought to be engaged in that maybe we haven't talked about at our kitchen table.
Yeah. Let me pull a historical thread here about is this likely to happen or not, which is a question we get a lot. And the first answer is, I hope not. With all my heart, I hope this is not a story of predictive fiction. I hope it is, as you said, cautionary fiction. But put yourself back just over 100 years ago, say in Europe in 1905 to 1910, somewhere in that range. Serious thinkers were writing books, not about a coming war. They were writing books about the impossibility of war. They wrote literally books about how all those economies were so intertwined and those royal families were so intermarried. Queen Victoria was the aunt of the Kaiser of Germany. Everyone said, we can't get in a war. That's so 19th century. Well, how did that turn out? Go read Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August. Your point, they stumbled into it. They miscalculated a small incident, the assassination of a Grand Duke of all things in a small town, Sarajevo, in the Balkans, lights this configuration that destroys Europe, destroys the Austro-Hungarian Empire, destroys the Ottoman Empire, changes the face of the world, and you can drop a plumb line to the rise of fascism, the Great Depression, and the Second World War, by the way. So clock it in at about 80 million dead. Yet in 1905, no one imagined that. That is, in the end, the cautionary tale that's here. And cyber is where one type of incident could occur. And the other one, as we describe in the very beginning of the book, is the South China Sea, where two great nations dispute those waters. And by the way, the South China Sea is not, some little body of water. It's half the size of the continental United States. It's the size of the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea combined. China claims that in its entirety, it is entirely possible that we have an incident there that lights a spark, especially 10 to 15 years from now, when China will have advanced in all of these technologies and will be feeling, shall we say, quite robust about their chances in a conflict.
Yeah,
that's what I worry about.
And again, that's one of the reasons I like the book, because we often talk about, what happens when some of those ships bump in the night, and how do you make sure that thing doesn't escalate to a point where we're in a big time shooting war. And so those are really great points, Admiral. I see we have a queue of questions queuing up. I could talk to you guys both all the time, but I know who you are, so I'll buy you a glass of wine and do that. I'm going to turn it over to Dan to get into our queue and get some of these questions. So thank you so much to both of you, and thanks for writing. I think this is going to be an important work of fiction, if you can say that. I do. It's that first foray into, pay attention, folks. This thing could get out of control in a hurry. Dan?
Dan,
thanks.
Can I throw in one really quick question? And I recognize this question has a danger of being a long question, but I'm hoping I can get them to comment relatively quickly. But I'm just really interested to know your perspective, having the background in these issues and then gaming these things out in the book. How prepared or not prepared are we today for this fight, Admiral?
We are kind of medium prepared for it, and I'll unpackage it in 5 sentences. In terms of cyber, as the chairman just alluded to, I see our greatest mismatch between the level of threat and the level of vulnerability. In terms of conventional combat at sea, we still have an edge over China. Our Navy is more capable, more powerful. We have long-range air that can come in from many bases in our allies, partners, and friends in the region. We would do reasonably well, but we could suffer significant casualties and losses. The really dark end of the stream is a Taiwan invasion. There, I think it's a toss-up between the US and China.
Elliot, do you want to add anything to that?
I would just only add thematically something that comes up in the book a number of times is not whether or not our technology is state of the art enough, but whether or not we actually have the correct technology and are adaptive enough when our technology fails us or we're forced to respond to an adversary. Sort of an analogy that was in my head as we were working on the book was not to go too far back, was the Battle of Agincourt, which, if you're not familiar with it, a bunch of state-of-the-art, extremely heavily armored French knights decided they were going to cross a muddy field to chop up a bunch of unarmored British longbowmen, not understanding that at that point, the longbow had conquered the heavily armored knight in terms of technological sophistication. So doesn't matter how much armor you've got, if you're facing a longbow, it's the wrong technology.
Thank you. Dan, sorry, back over to you.
No, I'd love to keep going about the longbow and medieval A2 AD strategy, but we've got some questions here. One question I want to ask, Admirals, you spoke of how the Cold War literature was very sober about what could happen if the balloon went up. How do you feel, and do you have concerns about the increasing wolf warrior jingoism we see in China, and how that translates into popular media there about conflict with the United States?
I do. And in particular, you see the rising level of nationalism in China. And this is something President Xi has tapped into. He will continue to use it as he cements his own role as the second coming of Mao Zedong. He is keenly aware of it's China's time to swagger on the world stage. He will leverage the events of the pandemic to say to the world, look how well we handled it. We had that V-shaped recovery everybody talked about. We got rid of masks months ago. We know what we're doing. Authoritarian plus capitalism, pretty good combination. There'll be a lot of swagger in the step of China going forward. They'll use it to double down on one belt, one road. And it's going to be a very challenging period for the United States. And again, 10 to 15 years from now, I think is when this really starts to rise up. On that point, so what should we do about it, Admiral? In addition to responding to it forcefully, telling our story, using our cultural tools to demonstrate the U.S. role in the world. Another part of this is the role of India, which will become apparent to those who read the book. I always say about one belt, one road, it's got one big problem, and the problem is India. India sits geographically right in the center of one belt, one road. It's a massive democracy that by the middle of this decade will overstrip China's already declining demographics. India, I think, will be a big part of the story in this 21st century. The more the US and Europe can kind of pull India toward us, Japan, Australia, working together, I think we create a real balance. Many voices in the diplomatic world are the right response to the wolf warrior diplomacy of China, which is essentially one voice. China has basically no allies. We have a plethora. We ought to get the choir singing.
Elliot, do you have any other thoughts on that?
No, I agree with all that.
Great. In the book, and both of you have extensive military careers, and Elliot, perhaps first on this, how did your experience with the fog of war and the idea that you can plan all you want, but when it actually happens, Eisenhower said planning is essential, plans are useless. How did that affect how you played out the events and charted this story?
I think that comes down to the original vision of the book and why we were aligned from the outset. When I was a Marine, they taught me that the definition of war is the contest between two human wills. And so by definition, one cannot tell a true war story without getting at the humanity of the individuals involved and showing who they are, their characters, and how major events hinge on that level of decision making. So with regards to our military experience, I think that an understanding of, yes, the geopolitics are important, the technology is important, but oftentimes it just comes down to individuals in a room, or a pilot in a cockpit, or naval officers on a bridge trying to make the best decisions they can in extremely challenging circumstances. And so we very much wanted to capture and show vividly the human element of war as well, which is, timeless. It's always existed. It's why war is infinitely fascinating.
Can I just give a classic example that was banging around in my brain? It was the terrible incident where the USS Vincennes mistook an Iranian commercial airliner for an incoming fighter and shot it down. This was decades ago, but it is a classic example of the fog of war. And, the United States, we kind of don't remember that. That was a 9/11 level incident in the Islamic Republic of Iran, I guarantee you. They remember the names, they know everyone who was on it, they know the age of the children. It was arguably one of the worst days in the history of the United States Navy. And it was junior officers who were in a combat information center who got caught up in a variety of distracting events, classic fog of war. Yet here they were on the most advanced technological warship in the world at that point, with a highly sophisticated spy radar system. Everything should have allowed them to instantly understand what was going on. But people are young, they're at sea, they've been exhausted, they make mistakes in that cockpit, in that combat information center, on a patrol, going into a house in a field in Afghanistan. And these mistakes are tragic. They're part of the fog of war. But importantly for our conversation here, they can be the spark. They can be the miscalculation that moves two great nations into war. Big doors swing on small hinges again and again in history.
In creating the novel and gaming out the scenario at the geopolitical level, how did you look at the interests of various countries, those players, and weigh them as you came up with your scenario? What factors, demographics, nationalism, economics, et cetera, played into those?
I'll start on that. India would be a pretty good example of this. I think, we all go to lots and lots of conferences that are put on where the great events of our day are discussed. Who do we talk about? We talk about the US, we talk about China, we talk about the European Union, we talk about Russia. We almost never talk about India. Yet 250 years from now, when the history of this century is written, that historian will be writing my view about the rise of India by the time we get to the end of the century, because of demographics, because it's already a democracy, et cetera. So we looked at each of the nations whose stories we wanted to tell here, and we thought consciously about their demographics, their industrial capability, their military might. We probably pulled some things forward that won't happen quite by 2034, and maybe we left some things out that'll be after it. But I think we got roughly the right markers down on each of the nations involved here. Russia will be a spoiler. Iran will be aligned with China. Oh, by the way, we wrote this book. We were writing it almost 2 years ago. What happened last week? Iran and China signed a $400 billion deal for cooperation going forward. India, I just spoke about. US, with all our divisions and challenges in this book, finds itself without many obvious allies. You don't see NATO in this book. You don't really see Japan in this book. What happened to that network of allies, partners, and friends? It's not there by 2034. I think that's a possibility if we don't tend that garden.
I would just add, from a structural point of view and book writing point of view, one of the great challenges and enjoyments of this book was figuring out how, with 5 characters, we were going to take you all the way around the world to include all of this. So if you pick up the book, you'll sort of see how we were able to try to balance telling a story that's both intimate and focused on these characters, but also gets you to all of these places in a way that feels authentic.
Yeah,
by the way, you
and,
did an
and
excellent
again,
job on that.
yeah, exactly. And again, in addition to revealing that there will be an FBI character in the next book, we might be opening the prism a little bit, because there are thoughts to be had, and characters like Japan, third largest economy in the world, declining demographics, but highly advanced in robotics, artificial intelligence. How does that play into geopolitics? So stay tuned. Can I make one quick point? Because it's actually a question for the chairman. And it's a political question. And I think it fits with the mission of this wonderful center. In the book, the President of the United States, in 15 years from when we started writing the book, is a woman. That's, I think, unsurprising to anybody. But she is neither a Republican nor a Democrat. And people say to me, well, that's kind of unrealistic. Stavridis, you don't know anything about domestic politics. And that's probably true. But I would say this, nowhere in the Constitution does it say there will be two political parties named Republican and Democrat, and the President of the United States shall come from one of those political parties. That's not how it works. In fact, we started with Whigs, Nationalists, Federalists. We finally got to Republicans, we got to Democrats. Yeah, they have a pretty locked grip on the levers of power. And it may not be by 2034, but I'll tell you what, I look at my two millennial daughters who look at both parties and just shake their heads. Chairman, comments?
Oh, look at the time. We're almost out of time here. I will say this, the fastest growing party identification in America is independent of the parties.
Bingo.
Yeah. And so if you look at that, it's a chasm, because the parties are pulling us to the edges versus trying to find something that embraces the majority of Americans who are center right, center left. Yep. In the way they live their lives. And I'll just throw in there that, George Washington, our first president, said, beware of parties. Do not entangle the country in the policies of parties because of their small-mindedness. Excuse me. I don't think I really don't think that that's as crazy as we think it is today, because of the way we talk about it, because of social media, because of the way people engage. It's bigger than the party structure can contain. And really those party structures, and I'm not necessarily saying that a two-party system wasn't good for America for a very long time, but I think that people are going to start taking a look at the option of finding parties that aren't party loyal before they're American loyal. And I think that's going to be so I don't think it's as crazy as it sounds. I think it is a big task, but I don't think it's as crazy as people would have you believe.
Thank you, sir. I think our revels now are ended, at least for me. I have to go do some business for the Carlyle Group, where I am an operating executive. Can I conclude by saying, Chairman, it is such an honor to be on any program with you anytime, and let's do it again. And to the team at the center, thank you for having me on board. Elliot?
Well, we're honored to have you anytime. Thank you for your leadership subsequent to your leadership in the United States Navy. You're providing, I think, great wisdom and a great take on things as we go forward. And a great book, by the way, people. You got to read this thing. I think you'll be enlightened and entertained, if that's possible anymore.
Thank you all. Thank you both for being with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Chairman Rogers.
Thank you. Thanks, Elliot. Look forward to getting together.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Take care.